Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Michaela Habersky, and I work as the Marketing and Events Assistant for the Jefferson Educational Society. It's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program. Tonight, we are honored to explore a pivotal moment in early American history, the bicentennial of Lafayette's farewell tour. In 1824, the Marquis de Lafayette, French nobleman and Revolutionary War hero, embarked on a 13-month journey that took him across the 6,000 miles and 24 states. Through the eyes of one of George Washington's closest friends, we gain a deeper, more personal understanding of our nation's first president, what our speaker calls a richer history than imagined. We're delighted to welcome Richard J. Arthur, a Pittsburgh native, retired Army officer, and lifelong student of American history. Richard has shared his knowledge through lectures on the Founding Fathers, the Continental Army, and Pennsylvania's role in major events like D-Day. He holds a degree from Allegheny College and George Washington University, and today resides in rural Erie County with his wife, Mary Lou, where they operate Winter's End, an environment dedicated to supporting bees and butterflies. Before we begin, a couple housekeeping upcoming events. On Thursday, May 29th at ECAT, Joshua Tuck will present ACL Tear Diagnosis and Management, New Treatment Approaches to an Old Problem. On Monday, June 2nd, at the Lincoln Library in Fairview, JES Ramey Fellow Sarah McCall will explore the role of public libraries in addressing the loneliness crisis. And on Wednesday, June 11th, Sarah McCall will be here in Harbor Creek to present on the same topic. Now, join me in welcoming tonight's speaker, Richard Arthur.
Do I need to? Oh, no, I'm mic'd. Yeah. Okay, welcome. Thank you for coming. This is a very special week because we now are celebrating the 200th anniversary of Lafayette's return to America. And this is special because he was the last surviving general from the Revolutionary War, and he was invited back by President Monroe. And you can see up here, and I invite you to come up at the end, take a look at the expansive tour he made of the country. Everywhere he went, he was welcomed as a hero because they were closer to the event. They had not forgotten about Lafayette, and so many times today, a lot of people don't know. I did a television spot yesterday and was quite surprised to find that most of the other people on the show with me had never heard of Lafayette. I was really surprised. Today, however, we're going to use Lafayette as a foil to learn more about George Washington. Probably no one understood and knew Washington in his adult life better than Lafayette. So we'll get right to it. We'll figure out why this relationship was important and what we can learn about Washington from it. In August of 1777, Lafayette, who had traveled over to America from France at his own expense on a ship he bought with his own money, came and he met George Washington. This could be considered, I think, possibly the most important two-way relationship in American history, because the date they met, they pretty much sealed a relationship that would ensure that we could win the Revolutionary War. Without that relationship, I think the outcome would have been in doubt. So he's a very important figure. That's my point here. The day they met, let's talk about what happened. First of all, Washington is coming off a really, really bad year. He was up in New York on Long Island trying to defend Manhattan. He was defeated, and he put his tail between his legs and he ran across New Jersey and back into Pennsylvania to try to save his army. So it was not what you'd call a glorious year for Washington. Now, he did cross the Delaware and surprise British troops in Trenton, and that was wonderful, but that was not what you'd call a really significant military accomplishment. Well, an accomplishment, yeah, but a victory now. Young Lafayette was coming off a series of events of his own. He had bought his own ship with his own money, and this was because at 19, he inherited all this money. He was one of the richest people in Europe at age 19. He had met a British officer who happened to be the brother of King George III, who told him that George Washington and the American Revolution was the best thing since buttered toast. He was curious and he wanted to come over. So he left his pregnant wife. He defied his king. He sailed across the ocean in a zigzag fashion to avoid capture from British ships. And he arrived in South Carolina and made a difficult trip up to Philadelphia. So they meet. And you might say this is one of the most important meetings of American history. Now, Lafayette immediately was impressed with George Washington. Well, that's hardly news, because he was the type of person who would inspire confidence and admiration just by the way he stood in the room, his bearing and his presence. So there's nothing really all that unusual about that meeting from that point of view. What is interesting is how Washington perceived Lafayette. He had had several European officers come and attempt to join the cause. And they were all out for rank, glory, pay. Washington and Congress were tired of this whole shebang. But there was a difference in the way Washington saw Lafayette. Here's a quote from Washington's biographer, Douglas Southall Freeman. "I most earnestly wish we had not a single foreigner among us except the Marquis, who acts upon a very different set of principles than those who govern the rest." Washington's recognition of this difference says something to us about Washington's character. He was able to sort out people who were on his side, who were positive, who were helpful, and people who were poisonous, cancerous, disruptive, or whatever. So this is one of the lessons from the encounter. Shortly after they met, they had what Lafayette called the Great Conversation. And this is where Washington told Lafayette, "Son, you are a good guy. I am impressed with you. I'm going to look out for you." And Lafayette says, "Good, give me some troops to lead." And Washington says, "Wait, you have no military experience aside from marching on a parade ground in Paris. You are 20 years old. Your English is broken. I'm going to put you on my staff." This had an interesting relationship for Lafayette. Now, Washington and Lafayette had something very special in common. They both had been kicked out of the country that they wanted to serve, basically. Washington had done all of these things during the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, for the British Empire, wearing a militiaman's uniform and serving the king. His appeal, can I become an officer in the British Army? Oh, no, no, no. You're a colonial. You'll never be one of us. Lafayette was a member of the inner circle. He was a member of royalty. He should have been allowed to do it, but they were reorganizing things in France and changing things around, and they basically told Lafayette, you can't be part of the big army. You can just be over here with this little militia type operation. You can parade on the parade grounds outside of Versailles or in Paris, but you can't be part of the main effort. So they're both spurned by their country and king. They had something else in common. Washington's father died when he was 9. He was basically raised by his brother Lawrence. So he had no natural father. Lafayette's father died before he ever had a chance to see young Lafayette. He was killed in the 7 Years' War, which was the equivalent of the French and Indian War over in Europe. Here you see a picture of him outside of the palace where he lived as a young man on a horse. He wanted to be a military man. So Washington's invitation to put him on his staff caused him a little bit of frustration. But there was a little bit of a twist to this, and it might have something to do with language barrier or culture. In the British Army, a general's staff was called his family. So fatherless Lafayette, childless Washington, come and be part of my family. Sounds very, very inviting. So I'm in your family, can I lead troops? No, I can't do that. You can't do that. You're on my staff. I'm going to keep an eye on you, though. He would have to wait and bide his time in order to get an opportunity with Washington. Why? Washington was careful. He was not going to allow something like this to be put out there just to satisfy someone's personal whim, or maybe even his own personal desire or opportunity to give Lafayette a chance to prove himself. So Washington, we learn, is a little bit careful. So Lafayette had to wait for a while to have an opportunity. He had to wait a whole 5 weeks. The British are attacking from the Chesapeake Bay and trying to come in and attack Philadelphia. Washington is putting up a defense on Brandywine Creek. Not a real big river or anything, but a reasonable place to have a defense. And he's doing pretty well until some Quaker family over here decides that they're loyalists, and they tell the British, oh, by the way, there's a ford over here you can use, and you could bring your troops around here, and you could flank Washington, because he doesn't know about that ford. So the troops come around. Washington's right is in danger. It is collapsing. In what I would call a put me in there coach moment, Lafayette goes to Washington and says, I'll run out there, I'll go out there. And Washington, according to his biographer, Southall Freeman, who's always an advocate of Washington, Washington was a little bit panicked. So he probably said, sure, go out there and do something. Well, he did. He went out there and he did something. He organized troops in broken English. He persuaded them to get in order and retreat in an orderly fashion, allowing the troops to basically shore up the right flank for Washington. He took a bullet in his leg, and he continued to lead. And they basically ended up as a draw for the day. It was not a victory for either side, but the army didn't collapse, and it didn't get captured, and it didn't get ruined. General Greene, who was probably Washington's best commander, said, oh, that kid's got something. I saw him. He ran to danger, and he put order on the troops. Said, I think he should be given a command. Even more telling, Washington tells his surgeon to care for Lafayette's wound as if he were my son. So we now have a very firmly established relationship between the two men. We see Washington being prudent. We see Washington being tender at the same time. After he recovers from his wound, he is again in battle in New Jersey, and he is fighting with Washington at the Battle of Monmouth. A long, hot, long battle. Again, probably a draw But again, the army is saved. The army is saved in part by actions taken by Lafayette. Washington has now come around to respect, and his respect is not given out without proof. So he's come to prove that he is a good guy, he's capable, and Washington buys it. He said, you saved me at Brandywine, you helped save me here at Monmouth Courthouse. I trust you. That evening, after a very exhaustive day, Washington lays out his cloak and gets ready to go ahead and go to sleep, probably dead tired. And he tells Lafayette, come over here and you can sleep over here beside me. That is a level of familiarity that Nathaniel Greene said was never extended to anybody else that Washington ever worked with. He was not a familiar person. So they have this very, very tight relationship. And I think we see on Washington's character, after a very, very long and hard battle, someone who is able to extend a courtesy, a kindness to someone else. Washington and Lafayette both suffered the hardships of Valley Forge. I don't think there's much I need to say about that. I think you all know and understand and appreciate that Valley Forge was a test for everyone, and it was a test for Lafayette. It was also an opportunity for Washington to see that some other foreign officers could actually make a contribution. But again, he was very reserved and very reluctant to just give out opportunity to others. Now, this is a very important aspect of Washington's character. About this time, when Washington was at Valley Forge, he was being challenged by people in Congress. They weren't satisfied with the progress of the war. There were people who were out to try to replace him. There was an effort to try to elevate and possibly replace Washington with this Thomas Conway, who was an Irish officer who'd come and served. And Lafayette just liked this guy. He just latched on to Conway. He loved the stories that he would tell about fighting over in Europe. He was completely enamored. And he even wrote off to Congress saying Conway should be advanced to the Inspector General position. He did not understand that he was actually doing something that would undermine Washington. So, things start to take place. A cabal tries to get into motion to replace Washington. Lafayette realizes, oh no, I was part of this. Part of the charge was that Washington was leaning too much on his young staff, including Lafayette and Lawrence and Alexander Hamilton. Now, this is an indication of Washington's genius, I think, as a commander. I don't think that it's a bad thing for a senior commander to rely on other people to give him advice, such as General Meade showing up at Gettysburg after the first day of battle. He got his generals together and, hey guys, what's going on? What should we do? I think it shows good judgment to use that type of a technique. But it was told to Congress that that was weak leadership if you depend too much on these young guys. Now Lafayette has to eat his words. He has to apologize to Washington. And in typical 18th century format, he sends him a letter that's about 4 pages long, and the first 4.5 pages are preliminary to what he needed to say. But then he gets to the point. Oh my God, I have kind of betrayed you. And here's what we learn about Washington. Washington's response to Lafayette. Lafayette says, I'm now fixed to sustain you with my sword and my power. And Washington's reaction is, my dear Marquis, you offer me fresh proof of our friendship and attachment, which I've happily experienced since our first acquaintance. In other words, I get it, don't worry about it, move on. So I think that says a lot about Washington's character. Lafayette goes off to France and then returns to the action. He goes to France to perform important diplomatic initiatives that we can't go into on this particular topic, but let's just say that it was critical to the war's effort. When he returns, he goes to Newport. I thought when I first started to research this that this wasn't going to be important. But boy, was I wrong, because we really learned a lot about George Washington. And we know what he said and what he did because Washington was in Philadelphia and Lafayette was in Newport. So all their correspondence was in writing, which we have. So we know what they said to each other. Lafayette in Newport sees the arrival of the first French naval engagements and forces into Newport Harbor. And he's there with some American generals. And there's a lot of spats between the French admiral and the American generals. And they're arguing back and forth. And Lafayette is kind of caught in the middle. So he's trying to do the best he can to moderate the situation. And he writes to Washington, and it's kind of whiny what he writes to Washington. But he's desperately trying to depict what's going on between these people. General Greene, General Sullivan. So Washington writes back. There's so much you can see about Washington in his reply. First of all, he's telling Lafayette, take no offense to D'Estaing, the admiral, or his fleet. For if he'd have been American, his complaints would have even been worse. And in a free and republican government, people will speak as they think. Or more properly, they will speak without thinking. So again, he is mellowing the situation, backing off the gas and telling him not to worry. I love this next part of the message. It's the nature of man to be displeased with everything that disappoints a favorite hope. Too many people are inclined to criticize without knowing the facts. Use your utmost endeavors to restore harmony and the mutual trust of the nations. So he's telling them, first of all, don't worry. Second of all, he's saying this is the nature to have this type of disagreement. It's okay to be disappointed, but buck up and get with the program and do what you can to bring these guys together. Again, in Newport, there's an interesting challenge. The British send an envoy over to Newport, not to Philadelphia, to Newport, to try to split the Americans from the French. And this really upsets Lafayette. Remember, at this point, he still basically doesn't like the British at all. He said they killed his father. So he takes offense, and in the 18th century manner of someone who is offended, what is the response to that? I challenge you to a duel. Well, the French admiral immediately panics. He goes, you can't do that. Don't do that. Don't do it. Just as someone shouting to someone who's about to jump off a bridge. You can't always bring someone around by doing things that way. Washington's approach was different. Lafayette, do you really want to leave that to chance? I mean, duels are a matter of chance. And if you leave that to chance, it might deny you the opportunity of future military glory. So what's he doing? He's appealing to this guy's base desire for heroism, and he's talking him down off the bridge by saying, you know, tomorrow could be brighter. You don't want to give up that choice, that opportunity. You don't want to lose that very, very valuable chance at something really substantial just by chance. So the duel is called off. I say that talks a lot about Washington's diplomatic skill. And those of you who have read anything about the Constitutional Convention and the machinations that go on there would appreciate that, as well as what Washington had to do when he was president. He would have to bring people together and make things work by appealing to their interests like that. Lafayette, when Lafayette was in Paris, we learn a lot about Washington. Anybody who would arrive into Washington's camp who had recently been in France, and I guess they were coming in all the time, Washington's first response was, "Did you talk to Lafayette?" He encounters one diplomat who said, "Yes, I encountered him in Paris, and he's a very, very fine fellow." Washington grabs this man's hands and is almost in tears, just as if a father would be caring about someone saying something nice about his own son. So I think we see a side of Washington you don't see when you're looking at his face on the dollar bill. Near the end of the war, Lafayette played an extremely important military role that most people aren't even really aware of. But he and his French troops that he brought over, about 14,000 of them, were able to keep General Cornwallis and the British troops in Virginia in a state of total confusion. They'd go in and they'd do these little hit and run operations, and then they'd run away. And they completely baffled and exhausted Cornwallis to the point where he would eventually go to Yorktown, hunker down, and eventually have to surrender. But what I like about this is kind of a soap opera type story. While he was there, there was something else going on. There was something else going on that was rather personal, and I think it is an interesting story. The British officers in charge included Benedict Arnold, who had now jumped over to the British, and of course, Washington was very, very anxious to extract any revenge he could on Benedict Arnold. So, in essence, he's sending his son out to get even with Benedict Arnold. I'm sure there were military conversations and decisions that overrode that, but that was still very much in the works. Also, one of the commanders was the British General Phillips. Lafayette had a problem with General Phillips. General Phillips had killed Lafayette's father in the 7 Years' War over in England and France. So there was another dynamic going on here that I thought just made things a lot more interesting. Now, of course, at Yorktown, a couple things have happened. The British fleet is bottled up in Yorktown. Why? Because the British Navy lost a battle off the Chesapeake Bay to the French Navy that was there only because of people such as Lafayette who made that possible. The Americans had no navy. They couldn't have done that. So Cornwallis is bottled up. He can't get out. And over the course of the next several weeks, they perform a siege and they are able to, let me back up here a second. They're able to prevail and get a surrender. On the last couple days, Lafayette goes to Washington and said, you know, I've done so much for you. I really need to lead one of the assaults on one of those redoubts. I need to be the guy to do it. These are my troops. They trust me. We've had a lot of operations together. I'm really the guy. Washington said no. Why? Because Washington was concerned that an American would lead the effort. It wasn't because he didn't trust Lafayette at this point. It wasn't because he didn't think that Lafayette would do a good job. It wasn't because he didn't like Lafayette. He was thinking first of his country and the impact that the leadership would have if it had been handed off to the French. And when Cornwallis surrendered, on the field of surrender, they attempted to actually surrender to Lafayette because he was from a real army. He wasn't from a renegade bunch. And of course, Lafayette refused and turned it over and made it the Americans accept the sword of surrender. But that says a lot about Washington. He loved Lafayette, he cared about him, but he wasn't going to let him take over at a time when it might be perceived that the French had somehow won that battle. After the war, we still learn a lot about Washington from Lafayette, especially in this visit in 1784. Lafayette at this time is not involved yet in the French Revolution, and he has the American Revolution behind him, and he comes for an extended visit to Mount Vernon. I'm going to read a section here of his letter. Excuse me, please. This is Washington's letter to his wife, Adrienne, back in France during his time here at Mount Vernon. He said, Washington's simplicity is sublime. He is completely involved in the details of his house and lands. His typical day begins with breakfast, then he's off to attend to his affairs. He loves talking about agriculture, and unlike French homes where children are kept hidden away, Washington and Martha have her orphaned grandchildren out and give them the run of the house. He has received much attention from his grandchildren, nieces, nephews, and neighborhood children. So when you see the dour face of Washington on the corner next time, you can think of him as like a nice old grandpa, among other things, if the situation allowed. We do learn a little bit more about Washington on, this is where Lafayette stayed when he was at Washington's house. It's a restored room at Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon has no recorded messages that indicate where any of the many visitors, the hundreds of visitors that Washington had, none of them, except they know where Lafayette stayed. That's the only one. There was one important difference of opinion that they had between them. It was over the issue of slavery. Lafayette's commitment to liberty was pure, unalloyed. He believed in liberty. He believed in liberty for everyone. So he proposes to Washington, I've got an idea. Let's jointly develop a plantation, and we could bring people in and we could train them. And you've got workers out on Mount Vernon that are out there doing different types of crafts. They could easily become freemen. We could do that. We could get them ready. We could teach them to read and teach them citizenship and let them be freed. Washington decides to discuss this in a letter with Lafayette. Lafayette says, your participation in this would help render this a general practice. Washington's response, it's a bit of a wild scheme. Lafayette, if it be a wild scheme, I had rather be mad in this way than thought wise in the other task. Here's where we see where Washington, bound, I'm sure, by the economic and cultural realities that he faced, and knowing that he had soldiers who had fought for him, had servants that he liked, had spies who had spied for him during the war who were black, his response was, the scheme you proposed to encourage emancipation of the black people of this country, or that state of bondage in which they are held, is a striking evidence of your benevolence. I should be happy to discuss it with you the next time we have the pleasure of meeting. They never met again. You can see Washington fighting there because he kind of gets it. During the time that the French Revolution, Lafayette always tried to be the guy in the middle. He tried to get the king and the crowd into some type of an organized effort to restore peace and tranquility to what was chaotic in France. And I mean, you had the crazies over here, you had the crazies over here. They took turns chopping each other's heads off. And you have people like Lafayette in the middle going, wait. Well, if you're the voice of moderation in times of turmoil, you are really in danger. And Lafayette felt he was in danger, so he runs away to take sanctuary in Prussia. They think that he's a revolutionary, so they clamp him in irons and throw him in prison for 5 years. Lafayette's family loved him so much that they went over and lived in prison with him for much of that time. So that was the type of relationship he had with his family, and it was one that he shared with Washington. Now, during this same time, he had a son, George Washington Lafayette. Of course he'd be named George Washington Lafayette, right? He was 14 years old, and the plan for him to be safe and escape the guillotine or the crazies was to send him to America and let George Washington take care of him. Now, we learn a lot about Washington because he was able to pull off something that was really very difficult. Washington was president at this time. He's the president of the United States. Dare he publicly give sanctuary to someone who is basically in exile from a country in turmoil and throw America to one side or the other? No, he didn't want to do that. So he and Alexander Hamilton worked out a scheme so basically they could do this on the QT. It was kind of invisible, and he was able to save the life of George Washington Lafayette through the turmoil of the Revolution. Washington balancing personal loyalty and country. Good news, George Washington Lafayette survived, and his family still exists today. And I had the opportunity to meet these 3 nice young women who came over for an event last August. So Washington saved that portion of his adopted family, and they live today. throughout the Revolution over there, Lafayette and Washington had a continuous conversation. There was an effort to moderate the effects of what was going on, but Lafayette was basically unable to pull off the kind of successes that he did here for us in America. But it certainly was not for lack of effort. As a token of his esteem for Washington, he sent him the key to the Bastille, which of course was problematic in the Revolution over there. And if you go to Mount Vernon today, you can see the key to the Bastille. It hangs right in the main hall. Washington. What else did George Washington provide for America in addition to providing us with a country? Well, he was very important in the world of agriculture. And through Lafayette, we know he had an ongoing relationship with agriculturalists in Europe. One of the things that Lafayette did was he sent some jackasses over to, not people, real jackasses, he sent them over to Mount Vernon, and Washington bred them, and they became some of the first mules raised in America. And of course, mules were an important part of American agriculture for the next 100 years. So you might say that among the things that Lafayette gave Washington was the opportunity to provide some improved agricultural experiences. This, I think, is one of the great testaments to Washington, about Washington, that we can learn from his relationship with Lafayette. 1798, or 97, Washington is out of office. He is an ex-president at this point. John Adams is our president. We have a diplomatic kerfuffle that puts America in both the sights of the British and the French at a time when our country is just basically getting started, doesn't really have any way to defend itself, is dependent on trade to both countries, trying to be as neutral as possible. Lafayette writes Washington, "With eagerness and pleasure would I fly to Mount Vernon and pour out all the sentiments of affection, respect, and gratitude that more than ever bind you to me." Okay, wonderful. Washington has to tell him no. And I think it must have broken his heart. But why did he do it? He writes back and said, "Our friendship has undergone no diminution or change, but the political situation precludes this at this time." What was Washington doing? What was his main concern? Was it his friendship to Lafayette? No. It was standing of our country at a time when we were in peril. So what can we learn about Washington from his relationship with Lafayette? We've seen examples of judgment, integrity, political skill, interpersonal skills, compassion. We learned that he liked ham and chicken from his correspondence with Lafayette. We know that he loved children. We know that he demonstrated trust through a very dynamic relationship with Lafayette. To me, however, one thing stands out. Washington would always choose the course he believed that would best serve his country. Placing America first for Washington meant putting aside personal interest and doing what is necessary, even at the pain of personal cost, to win and save what he called the prize, the independence, and the democratic republic that he helped build. So those are my thoughts on Washington and Lafayette. Thank you. Do you have any questions? Because I wasn't able to cover a lot of how much we treasure Lafayette and why he was special. So, yes, ma'am.
This is more about Lafayette. He came to Erie on his trip back, correct?
Absolutely, and we're celebrating the 200th anniversary of that this week. This is when he was in. You can see there's a map here of his trek through western Pennsylvania, up from Pittsburgh to Butler, Mercer, Meadville, Waterford, and Erie. And something happened at each one of those sites. I'll give you just a quick example. He traveled from Pittsburgh, where he was given a huge celebration. He was there for two or 3 days. Then he went to Butler, where, again, it was just a pioneer town at that point, but they had big flower arches, girls in white dresses. He shook 400 hands and ate a lot of sauerkraut. We know that. He then traveled to Mercer, where he stayed overnight in a hotel that no longer still stands. But if you go to the Mercer County Historical Society, you can see the bed he slept in. Now, when that hotel caught on fire, the proprietor of the hotel ran back into the hotel, chopped up Lafayette's bed so he could throw it out the window because it wouldn't fit. So it is saved by virtue of somebody who had a lot of respect for Lafayette, or maybe for marketing, I don't know. And next week, Mercer County will be putting a plaque up in their town square commemorating Lafayette's visit. In Meadville, he had lunch at a place called the Stag, which is down near where the Meadville Mall is downtown. And from there, he went to Allegheny College, and he addressed the students there and the faculty and signed their guest book. And then he went that evening to Waterford, where he stayed at a hotel where the post office is now in Waterford. But in the morning, his host took him across the street to just survey and inspect the Eagle Hotel that was under construction at the time. So as the docent at the Eagle Hotel, I often get asked, did George Washington stay here? No, he slept out on that ground over there. And did Lafayette stay here? Well, no, but he did come over and inspect the building. Then he did come to Erie, and they had a reception for him. People were lined up from Federal Hill all the way downtown. And considering that Erie had, probably a couple thousand residents at the time, that's absolutely amazing. People must have come from all around. And they were very, very excited.
Do you know where they had a banquet with the big, I read that it was very much near where Hammett Hospital is today, over the ravine?
Yes.
Correct?
Yes. Judy and I tried to go out and find any good evidence of that one time, and I think we concluded that it was basically there. We know that there was a reception held at a home that is no longer there, but there's a plaque that marks the spot.
Oh, is that right?
Yes. Now, the Hagen History Center has a wonderful collection of items from that day. They have silver services, and they have bonnets that young girls wore to the reception. My favorite thing, though, is they have the tablecloth that they used. And when they finished, the organizer for the event took the tablecloth and kept it. But they didn't wash the coffee stain that had spilled on it, because that was Lafayette that spilled the coffee, and I wanted to know where he sat. Yeah, it was a very, very great day for Erie, and really it was a wonderful time for all of us in this region.
All these small towns that he deigned to visit that really had not much significant importance at that time. I think that says a lot about Lafayette's character.
It does. 14 months he was on that trail. He visited all 24 states. He had hundreds of receptions. Every town had arches. They had horse-drawn carriages. They had bad speakers. They had poor bands. They had little girls coming out carrying flowers in white dresses. that was one of the points that I wanted to make. Was at the beginning I said so many people have forgotten. Mm-hmm. Well, they had not forgotten then. They knew either from their father or their grandfather or their uncle or somebody, they knew the value that he brought to our country, and his service was respected and honored. I think that it's interesting in Waterford, in the cemetery. I was given a tour, and there's a Revolutionary War soldier, and we talked about that. But one day I was up there, and I pivoted, and I saw an everyday gravestone there, and the man's first name was Lafayette. And I noticed his birth year, 1825. So someone in Waterford named their child Lafayette because of the visit. It was such a valued and important thing to do that. I talked to Vince McCall, who works at the cemetery of Waterford, and he said, "Oh, there's several people up there that have that name." And it was just the level of appreciation.
There's a wonderful biography of Lafayette published 2 or 3 years ago. I can't, of course, think of the name of it, but yep, that's the one. Excellent.
Yeah, this is probably the most readable and most contemporary. There are dozens of books on Lafayette, a lot of them from the 19th century, but this is good. I will tell you that at the end of his visit here to Erie, he went across on the Erie Canal and went to several towns, along the canal to hastily get to an appointment on the 4th of July to Bunker Hill, because they were going to break ground on the Bunker Hill monument that stands there. It's a little obelisk, like a Washington monument type thing. And he was able to get there in time. And he did the groundbreaking thing, you always see in the newspaper. And he did that, but he had a little cask over here for himself, and he filled that up with the dirt. He took that back to France. When he died, he had that dirt put on his grave because he felt that much kinship for our country. In 1917, when the American forces went over to France, General Pershing took his staff out there, and Colonel Stanton on his staff said, "Lafayette, we are here." They were visiting his grave. There was, again, an appreciation at that time when they were still striking commemorative medals and things like that for Lafayette that we've kind of lost today. There was a story that I had heard that I really didn't believe. But I asked Mike Duncan when I had the opportunity to meet him in August. When I asked him, I said, "Is this story true?" And he said, "Well, I can't really say for sure, but he believes that it is." The story is that a flag has flown, an American flag, has flown over Lafayette's grave for over 150 years. Now, think about that statement. What was going on in Paris in 1943? Supposedly, the flag never came down. It was up the whole time, even during the Nazi occupation. Maybe out of homage to somebody who was a great character, I don't know. Maybe they didn't know it was there, I don't know. But Mike said that he thought it was true, so. Yes, ma'am.
I was lucky enough to hear one of your companion talks on him last week, and one of my takeaways was how gracious Lafayette was. And you're talking about all these little places he visited, and people coming up to him, treating him like a celebrity. He wasn't jaded. "I was with you at Brandywine." "Yes, I remember you."
Yes.
He didn't take anything for granted. Maybe that was political, but it was also very kind.
I think it was absolutely genuine. I think he absolutely believed it. Once he got hooked on the idea of liberty and believed in America, a country he'd never been to, but had fallen in love with and then embraced it, I think it was absolutely sincere. I think he was tireless. He must have been exhausted after that trip, but he was always gracious, energetic, enthusiastic, saying the nicest things you could say.
There's a level of humility there that, you know, besides your sense of honor, that humility where it wasn't about him, it was about the people that were there to greet him. You know, I just find that lacking nowadays.
My wife said he must have had a very high emotional IQ. And I think he did, because people generally liked him. Even Napoleon, he kind of clung to Napoleon as maybe the best option available at the time. But then he became disgruntled with Napoleon and pushed him away. But when Napoleon was on his death throes out in the middle of nowhere, and St. Helens, I guess, out in the Atlantic Ocean, he told the people that Lafayette was the best person that he'd ever worked with. Considering that Lafayette knew Rousseau, he knew Voltaire, he knew King George III, he'd personally been there and humiliated by George III. He knew Louis XV, Louis XVI. He knew every American president for the first 8 presidents, and had a personal dinner with them all. He knew he knew Washington Irving. He knew James Fenimore Cooper. When he went to Baltimore, a young kid named somebody who liked to write poetry, Edgar Allan Poe, delivered a poem to him honoring his visit there. He just, everybody knew him, and I think everybody liked him. I've spent the last 18 months with him, and I really like him too.
It's a very readable book.
Yeah, I thought so.
Compared to a lot of historical biographies.
I just want to give some recognition here to the fact that I knew him as a marginal character until I was introduced by Dr. Judy Lynch, who fired me up on this and has encouraged me to just do more and more. Thank you, Judy. Sir.
Are you aware of any events planned in Erie for the anniversary?
Yes, I will tell you that when I first started getting interested in this, I tried to get everybody in Western Pennsylvania I could reach out to do something. And I thought, nobody's going to do anything. And now people are doing things and have been doing things the last couple of weeks, and it's heartening. There will be an arrival of Lafayette down in front of the Children's Museum on the 3rd. Yes, the 3rd. He's coming into the Children's Museum on a carriage. There's a dinner, but it has been sold out, and I was happy to know that there was that much interest, but it happened. What the Jefferson has given me 5 opportunities to talk. There have been a lot of things going on. Butler, they're rededicating a plaque. The Erie Torch group had a talk. It hasn't gone unnoticed. I have an opportunity to talk at Allegheny College to the alumni this weekend, and they will have the guest book that Lafayette signed there. So that will be, and it's going to be very special for me because it's the same place where I got married. So kind of a special event for me. Okay, I'm going to give you one more thing before you go. Here's your homework for America 250. I'm sure you're going to have a lot of exciting dinner conversations with your friends and neighbors about what's going on in America, what should be recognized, what's important. I'm going to make a case. Here's my case. What is a founding father? Well, a founding father could be someone like a political theorist like John Adams or Thomas Jefferson. They're founding fathers. It could be a military leader like George Washington or Nathaniel Greene. They're founding fathers. It could be someone who was a diplomat who really made an important contribution, like Benjamin Franklin. It could be somebody who helped pay for the revolution, like Robert Morris, who basically lost all of his treasure giving money up for the revolution. You know, each one of those guys was good in their own department, or maybe even two areas. Can you think of anybody who was all four? You just met him tonight. He was a political theorist. He was a financier. He gave a lot of money. He was a diplomat. He made a significant contribution, and he was a very, very good soldier. So there's your case to make for your neighbors. It took us until 2002 to get him recognized as an honorary citizen. Thank you so much. Thank you.